I don't care what your ticket says. I'm not moving. The white woman's declaration cut through the first-class cabin as she dismissed Marcus, who stood calmly holding his boarding pass. She had no idea who she was really dealing with. Susan Whitmore sat in seat 1A like she owned it. Blonde hair perfectly styled, designer handbag claiming the armrest as she flipped through Vogue with theatrical indifference. When Marcus politely showed his boarding pass and asked for his rightfully paid seat, her response revealed everything about her sense of entitlement. "Excuse me," Marcus had said moments earlier, his voice measured and professional. "I believe you're in my seat." "This is 1A. I'm sitting here," she replied dismissively. "I was here first." But when Marcus didn't simply disappear as she expected, Susan escalated with the arrogance of someone who had never been told no. At 45, Marcus had experienced this pattern countless times. The assumption that he didn't belong, that accommodating him was optional. But tonight, after a week of swallowing subtle racism, Marcus was done accommodating other people's comfort at the expense of his dignity. As nearby passengers began to stare and whisper, Marcus had no idea that the phone call he was about to make would ground an entire airline. The cream-colored cabin of the Boeing 737-800 hummed with the quiet efficiency of first-class service. But Marcus Reed felt anything but comfortable as he stood beside row 1. His 6-foot frame, usually commanding respect in corporate boardrooms across the country, seemed suddenly diminished in the narrow aisle as other passengers squeezed past him with barely concealed irritation. He had deliberately dressed down for travel-dark jeans, a simple button-down shirt, and a lightweight blazer choosing comfort and anonymity over the power suits that usually announced his status. It was a choice he was beginning to regret. Susan Whitmore had settled into seat 1A with the territorial confidence of someone who had never been challenged, her movements deliberate and proprietary as she arranged her personal items in the space. Her Hermes scarf was draped artfully over the seat back, her Chanel purse claimed the armrest, and her leather portfolio occupied the seat pocket as if she were marking her domain. She was the embodiment of privileged entitlement, her every gesture radiating the assumption that rules were suggestions and accommodations were her birthright. "Ma'am, could you please check your boarding pass?" Marcus asked again, maintaining the professional courtesy that had served him well in countless business negotiations. "I have seat 1A reserved and paid for." Sarah Thompson, a blonde flight attendant in her 30s, approached with a customer service smile that seemed to falter slightly when she took in the scene. Her eyes moved from Marcus to Susan, and Marcus watched with growing unease as her demeanor shifted subtly. The warmth in her voice became noticeably cooler when she addressed him, while her tone remained deferential toward Susan. "Is there a problem here?" Sarah asked, but her body language suggested she had already decided who was the source of any potential disruption. "This gentleman is claiming my seat," Susan said, not bothering to lower her voice or show any concern for the growing attention from nearby passengers. "I've been sitting here since boarding began, and now he's insisting I move." Marcus noticed how Sarah didn't ask to see Susan's boarding pass, didn't question her version of events, didn't follow any of the standard protocols for resolving seating disputes. Instead, she turned to Marcus with the practiced patience typically reserved for difficult children. "Sir, to avoid any further inconvenience to other passengers, would you be willing to take seat 12B in business class? We'd be happy to refund the difference in fare, and I can assure you the service will be just as excellent." The casual injustice of the suggestion hit Marcus like a physical blow. Here was a flight attendant, a representative of an airline his company partially owned, asking him to give up his paid seat to accommodate someone who was clearly in the wrong. Not asking Susan to move, not checking documentation, not following standard procedure, just immediately assuming the black man was the problem that needed to be managed. "I paid for seat 1A, Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. "I'd like to sit in the seat I purchased." He watched as Sarah's smile became even more strained, her discomfort with his refusal to simply comply palpable in the recycled air of the cabin. Behind him, Marcus could hear the whispered complaints of passengers being held up by the situation, could feel their collective impatience pressing against his back like an accusation. But he remained calm, professional, and absolutely unmoved from his position. The cabin tension ratcheted higher as David Carlson, the head flight attendant, approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to resolving passenger disputes through a combination of authority and charm. In his 40s, with prematurely gray hair and an immaculate uniform, David embodied the airline's commitment to professional service. But as his eyes assessed the situation, Marcus detected the same subtle shift in demeanor he'd witnessed with Sarah, a cooling of warmth, a stiffening of courtesy that spoke to unconscious biases dressed up as procedural efficiency. "Good evening, Mr. Reed," David said, having apparently checked the passenger manifest. His tone carried the patronizing patience of someone addressing a child who was testing boundaries. "I understand there's some confusion about seating arrangements. Mrs. Whitmore here is one of our most valued Gold Elite members. She's been flying with us for over 15 years and has always been accommodated in first class when space permits." The casual rewriting of airline policy struck Marcus as both impressive and infuriating. Valued members didn't get to steal other passengers' seats simply by virtue of their status, but David delivered the explanation with such confident authority that nearby passengers began nodding in understanding. It was masterful misdirection, designed to make Marcus appear unreasonable for insisting on basic fairness. "I'm a Diamond Elite member myself," Marcus replied evenly, "and this is the seat I reserved and paid for 3 weeks ago. I'm not sure what accommodation policies you're referring to, but stealing another passenger's seat isn't typically considered customer service." David's face tightened almost imperceptibly at the word stealing, and Marcus watched him exchange a meaningful glance with Sarah. The crew was closing ranks, protecting their preferred passenger while treating Marcus like a disruptive interloper. It was a dance Marcus had seen performed countless times in his professional life, the subtle coordination of authority figures who shared an unspoken understanding about whose concerns mattered and whose could be dismissed. "Sir, I'm trying to find a solution that works for everyone," David continued, his voice carrying a note of barely contained irritation. "We have several excellent business class seats available, and I'd be happy to provide additional amenities to compensate for any inconvenience. Surely we can resolve this like reasonable adults." The implicit suggestion that Marcus was being unreasonable for wanting his paid seat stung, but not as much as the realization that this was exactly the kind of situation that happened every day to people who lacked his resources and connections. How many black passengers had been convinced to accept reasonable accommodations rather than demand equal treatment? How many had been labeled difficult or disruptive for refusing to yield to this casual racism disguised as customer service? Susan Whitmore watched the exchange with the detached amusement of someone enjoying a performance staged for her benefit. She had made no move to produce her own boarding pass, offered no explanation for how she had ended up in Marcus's seat, and shown no concern for the disruption her actions had caused. Her entitlement was so complete, so unquestioned, that she seemed genuinely puzzled by Marcus's refusal to simply disappear and make the problem go away. "Perhaps," Marcus said, his voice carrying a new edge of steel, "Mrs. Whitmore could show me her boarding pass so we can resolve this confusion directly." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus watched with grim satisfaction as both David and Sarah suddenly looked uncomfortable. They had been so eager to accommodate Susan and move Marcus along that they hadn't bothered with the most basic step of actually verifying who belonged where. It was an oversight that spoke volumes about their assumptions and priorities. The atmosphere in first class had grown thick with tension as Marcus's simple request for documentation seemed to stumble upon an inconvenient detail that everyone had been hoping to avoid. Susan Whitmore's confident demeanor flickered for just a moment, a micro-expression of uncertainty that Marcus caught before she recovered her composure. But that brief hesitation was enough to confirm what he had suspected. She was in the wrong, and had been counting on the crew's biases to protect her from consequences. Captain Robert Hayes emerged from the cockpit with the authoritative bearing of a man accustomed to having his word treated as final. At 55, with silver hair and 4 stripes on his shoulders, he commanded instant respect from passengers and crew alike. But as he surveyed the scene, Marcus detected the same familiar pattern, the automatic assumption that he was the source of the problem rather than the victim of it. "Gentlemen, ladies," the captain said, his voice carrying across the first-class cabin with practiced authority, "we have 200 passengers waiting to get to Los Angeles, and we're currently holding up departure for what appears to be a seating dispute. Mr. Reed, I'm going to need you to work with my crew to resolve this situation immediately." The public calling out was calculated and humiliating, designed to pressure Marcus into compliance through the weight of collective disapproval. Marcus could feel the eyes of every passenger in the forward cabin upon him, could sense their growing irritation with his stubbornness. But beneath the professional tone, he heard something else, the casual assumption that he, rather than the woman illegally occupying his seat, was responsible for the delay. "Captain," Marcus replied, his voice steady and clear, "I'm happy to resolve this. I'd simply like to sit in the seat I purchased, seat 1A. If Mrs. Whitmore could show her boarding pass indicating she belongs in this seat, I'll gladly take my concerns to customer service after we land." The request was reasonable, professional, and completely impossible to argue against. But instead of demanding Susan's documentation, Captain Hayes doubled down on his pressure campaign. "Sir, my crew has attempted to offer you several alternative accommodations. At this point, your refusal to accept reasonable solutions is bordering on disruptive behavior. I have the authority to remove passengers who interfere with flight operations, and I'd prefer not to use it." The threat was unmistakable, delivered with the confident backing of Federal Aviation Authority. Around them, Marcus could hear passengers beginning to voice their frustration more openly. "Just take the other seat," someone muttered. "Some people always have to make everything difficult," came another comment. The crowd was turning against him, just as the crew had calculated. But Marcus had spent decades navigating situations where authority figures tried to intimidate him into submission, and he recognized the pattern. The threat of removal, the public pressure, the implicit suggestion that his insistence on fair treatment was somehow unreasonable. It was textbook systemic discrimination dressed up as policy enforcement. Susan Whitmore finally spoke, her voice carrying across the cabin with theatrical concern. "I don't understand why this has to be so contentious. I've been accommodated in first class many times before when space was available. This gentleman seems determined to make trouble over something that could be easily resolved if he'd just be flexible." The masterful deflection painted Marcus as an inflexible troublemaker, while positioning herself as the reasonable party being harassed by an unreasonable man. It was gaslighting performed for an audience, designed to make everyone watching believe that Marcus's insistence on basic fairness was somehow the problem. Marcus felt his phone vibrate in his pocket and discreetly glanced at a text from Julia Martinez, his chief operating officer. "Tracking flight delay alerts." Everything okay? The irony wasn't lost on him. His own airline's systems were flagging the delay his mistreatment was causing. "Captain," Marcus said, his voice taking on a new tone of quiet authority, "I believe there's been a fundamental misunderstanding here. Before you threaten to remove me from this aircraft, I suggest you have your crew follow standard protocol and verify boarding passes for both passengers involved in this dispute." The calm confidence in his voice seemed to give Captain Hayes pause, and for the first time since the confrontation began, Marcus saw a flicker of uncertainty cross the man's face. But Susan Whitmore, perhaps sensing the mood shift, chose that moment to escalate. "I feel unsafe with this man's aggressive behavior," she announced loudly. "He's been harassing me since he got on the plane, and now he's arguing with the flight crew. I think we need security." It was the nuclear option, the white woman's ultimate weapon in any conflict with a black man. The invocation of fear, the claim of harassment, the demand for protection from the aggressive black man who was literally just standing in an aisle asking for his paid seat. Marcus felt the familiar rage building in his chest, but also something else, a cold, calculating fury that came from finally having the resources and platform to fight back against this pattern of systematic dehumanization. As Captain Hayes reached for his radio to call for airport security, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He pulled out his phone and placed a call that would ground more than just this single aircraft. The escalation happened in 3 distinct waves, each one building on the momentum of the last, until the situation spiraled completely beyond the crew's ability to control. Marcus watched it unfold with the detached fascination of someone observing a system destroy itself through its own inherent contradictions and biases. The first wave began when Captain Hayes' radio call brought airport security into the equation. Gate 23. We need assistance with an uncooperative passenger in first class. Individual is refusing crew instructions and causing flight delays. The clinical language was designed to create a specific narrative: Marcus as the problem passenger, the crew as the victims of his unreasonable behavior. But it also created a permanent record of the incident that would prove useful later. As they waited for security, the tension in the cabin reached a breaking point. Passengers began voicing their frustration more openly, and their comments revealed the ugly underbelly of assumptions that had been simmering beneath the surface. "This is exactly why I pay extra for first class," muttered a woman in row 2. "To avoid dealing with people like this." The comment was loud enough to be clearly audible, designed to sting and humiliate. A businessman in row 3 looked up from his laptop with visible irritation. "Look, we all want to get to LA. Just take the upgrade and stop making everyone else pay for your attitude problem." The casual dismissal of Marcus's legitimate grievance as an attitude problem perfectly encapsulated the mentality that enabled this kind of discrimination to flourish. But not everyone was against him. Marcus noticed a young black woman in business class pulling out her phone to record, her jaw set in grim recognition of what she was witnessing. An elderly white couple in row 4 looked uncomfortable with the crew's handling of the situation, whispering quietly between themselves about fairness and proper procedure. The second wave arrived when airport security officers Martinez and Johnson appeared in the jet bridge doorway. Officer Johnson, a tall white man in his 40s, immediately assessed the situation through the lens of the crew's narrative. His body language was confrontational as he approached Marcus, hand resting casually on his radio, as if preparing for resistance. "Sir, you need to comply with crew instructions or we'll have to escort you off this aircraft," Johnson said, his voice carrying the automatic authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "Captain Hayes has the final say on passenger behavior, and he's instructed you to take alternative seating." But Officer Martinez, a Latino man in his 30s, seemed more skeptical of the situation. His eyes moved between Marcus, Susan, and the crew with the assessing gaze of someone who had seen enough conflicts to recognize when something didn't add up. "Has anyone actually checked both boarding passes to verify who belongs in this seat?" he asked quietly. The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Marcus watched David Carlson and Sarah Thompson exchange uncomfortable glances. In their rush to accommodate Susan and pressure Marcus into compliance, they had skipped the most basic step of actually determining who was in the right. "We've been trying to resolve this through reasonable accommodation," David said, his voice defensive. "Mr. Reed has refused every alternative we've offered." "That's not what I asked," Officer Martinez replied. "Have you checked boarding passes?" The third wave began when Susan Whitmore, perhaps realizing that her position was becoming more precarious, decided to escalate further. "Officers, I've been flying first class with this airline for 15 years. I've never been harassed like this before. This man has been aggressive and threatening since the moment he approached me." The accusation of aggression was the trigger Marcus had been waiting for. Throughout the entire confrontation, he had maintained perfect composure, spoken in measured tones, and made no threatening gestures. But Susan was counting on the officers to take her word over his, to default to protecting the white woman from the aggressive black man. Marcus felt his phone buzzing with increasing frequency texts from Julia, notifications from the company's crisis management system, alerts that a Reed Aviation Holdings executive was being detained on a company-affiliated aircraft. The irony was becoming too perfect to ignore. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez said carefully, "I've been watching this interaction, and I haven't observed any aggressive behavior from Mr. Reed. He's been standing calmly in the aisle asking for his seat. That's not harassment. The validation was like oxygen to Marcus's lungs, but it also seemed to panic Susan and the crew. They had counted on the officers accepting their version of events without question, and Martinez's skepticism was undermining their entire narrative. Captain Hayes tried to reassert control. "Officer, this passenger has refused direct crew instructions and is causing significant flight delays. We need him removed so we can depart." "What specific instructions has he refused?" Martinez asked. "The instruction to give up his paid seat to another passenger without verification?" "Because I need to tell you, Captain, that's not actually a crew instruction passengers are required to follow." The conversation was turning against them, and Marcus could see panic beginning to set in among the crew. They had overplayed their hand, assuming that their authority would be automatically supported regardless of the circumstances. But Martinez's questions were exposing the fundamental weakness in their position. They had tried to resolve a simple seating dispute through intimidation rather than following basic procedures. Susan made one final desperate play. "I demand to speak to a supervisor. This is outrageous customer service. I'm going to report this entire crew for allowing a passenger to harass me." But her indignation rang hollow now, especially as Officer Martinez finally asked the question everyone had been avoiding. "Ma'am, could I see your boarding pass, please?" Marcus watched Susan's face cycle through a series of expressions: surprise, indignation, calculation, and finally, barely concealed panic. She reached into her purse with trembling hands, taking far longer than necessary to locate a document that should have been readily accessible. When she finally produced her boarding pass, her face was pale. "This shows seat 14F, Officer Martinez said after examining it, "in economy class." The silence that followed was deafening. 200 passengers, a full flight crew, airport security, and airline management had been held hostage for 30 minutes by a woman who belonged in economy class but felt entitled to first class. The magnitude of the lie, the audacity of the deception, and the crew's complicity in enabling it struck everyone simultaneously. Marcus felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest. The moment of revelation had finally arrived, but he wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The silence in the first-class cabin stretched like a held breath as the full weight of Susan Whitmore's deception settled over everyone present. Marcus watched the color drain from Captain Hayes's face as the implications became clear. He had threatened to remove a paying first-class passenger to accommodate someone who belonged in economy class. The crew's entire narrative collapsed in the face of this simple documentary evidence, and their carefully constructed authority crumbled with it. But Marcus wasn't ready to let them off the hook just yet. The systematic nature of their bias, the casual assumption of his guilt, and their willingness to threaten him with removal rather than follow basic procedures demanded a response that went beyond simple vindication. As Susan Whitmore sat frozen in seat 1A, clutching her economy boarding pass, Marcus's phone began to ring. The caller ID showed Thomas Brennan, CEO of Delta Airlines, and a man Marcus had known for over a decade through industry connections and business dealings. Marcus looked around the cabin, taking in the faces of the crew members who had spent the last 30 minutes treating him like a criminal, and made a decision that would reverberate through the entire aviation industry. "Hello, Tom," Marcus said, accepting the call and deliberately putting it on speaker so the entire cabin could hear. The effect was immediate and electric. Captain Hayes's eyes widened in recognition of his CEO's voice, while David Carlson and Sarah Thompson looked like they might be physically ill. The passengers in first class leaned forward. suddenly understanding that they were about to witness something unprecedented. "Marcus, I just got an emergency alert about an incident on Flight 1847. Brennan's voice carried clearly through the cabin, professional concern evident in his tone. "Our systems are showing a significant delay, and your name came up in the passenger manifest. What's happening out there?" Marcus let his gaze sweep across the crew members who had been so confident in their authority just moments before. Their faces showed a progression of emotions from confusion to dawning horror as they realized the magnitude of their mistake. "Well, Tom, your crew has spent the last 30 minutes trying to remove me from my paid first-class seat to accommodate a passenger who, it turns out, belongs in economy class. When I refused to give up my seat, I was threatened with arrest and removal from the aircraft." The words hung in the air like an indictment, and Marcus watched Captain Hayes mouth the word no silently as the full scope of the situation became clear to him. "Captain Hayes," Brennan's voice carried across the cabin with unmistakable authority, "are you there?" Hayes fumbled for words, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Yes, sir. Mr. Brennan, there's been a misunderstanding. We were trying to resolve a passenger dispute." "The passenger you were trying to remove," Brennan's voice cut through the stammering explanation with surgical precision, "is Marcus Reed, chairman of Reed Aviation Holdings and Delta's largest institutional shareholder. You were threatening to arrest your own boss for trying to sit in his paid seat." The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus could hear the air conditioning cycling, could feel the collective intake of breath from 200 passengers who suddenly understood they had witnessed something extraordinary. Susan Whitmore looked like she might faint, while the crew stood frozen in tableau of professional catastrophe. Marcus stood slowly, his movement deliberate and controlled. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had just remembered exactly who he was and what he could do. "I want to be very clear about something," he said, addressing not just the crew, but the entire cabin of passengers who had watched him be systematically humiliated and dehumanized. "I didn't ask for special treatment. I didn't demand recognition. I simply wanted to sit in the seat I paid for, like any other passenger. But instead, your crew automatically assumed I was the problem, threatened me with arrest, and were willing to remove me from this aircraft rather than ask to see a boarding pass." He gestured toward Susan, who had shrunk back into the seat as if trying to disappear. "This woman lied about her seat assignment, lied about her status, and accused me of harassment when caught. Your crew not only enabled her deception but actively participated in it by refusing to follow basic verification procedures." Officer Martinez stepped forward, his professional assessment of the situation complete. "Mr. Reed, on behalf of airport security, I apologize for any confusion. Mrs. Whitmore, you'll need to return to your assigned seat immediately, and we'll need to discuss your misrepresentation to airline staff." But Marcus wasn't finished. The systematic nature of what had happened demanded a systematic response. He pulled out his executive phone and placed another call, this one to Julia Martinez. "Julia, I need you to implement Crisis Management Protocol 7 immediately. This aircraft is grounded pending a full investigation of civil rights violations by crew members. I want complete documentation of this incident, including passenger witness statements and crew communications." The announcement that came over the cabin speakers moments later was unprecedented. "Ladies and gentlemen, Flight 1847 is experiencing an indefinite operational delay. Please remain seated while we address administrative issues." As the reality of the situation sank in, Marcus watched the faces around him transform from confusion to understanding. They had witnessed something more than a seating dispute. They had seen the casual machinery of discrimination in action, and its spectacular dismantling when confronted with real power and accountability. But the most important moment came when a young black woman from business class approached, her phone still recording. "Mr. Reed," she said quietly, "thank you for not backing down. I see this kind of thing happen all the time, but nobody ever has the power to fight back." Marcus nodded, understanding that the real victory wasn't personal vindication. It was the message being sent to every person who had ever been told to accept less than they deserved, to be reasonable in the face of unreasonable treatment, to accommodate other people's prejudices for the sake of keeping the peace. The system had revealed itself completely, and now it would face the consequences. The aftermath unfolded with the devastating efficiency of a controlled demolition. Within hours, the carefully constructed careers of Delta Flight 1847's crew began collapsing under the weight of their documented discrimination. Marcus watched the process from his Los Angeles office, where the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a perfect view of LAX's runways, a reminder of the industry he had helped build and now had the power to reshape. Captain Robert Hayes faced immediate suspension pending investigation. His 30-year career with Delta, built on a foundation of technical competence and leadership, crumbled as the company's lawyers reviewed video footage, passenger statements, and communications records. The man who had threatened to have Marcus arrested for wanting his paid seat now faced the prospect of losing his pilot's license for violating federal civil rights protections. David Carlson's termination came even faster. As head flight attendant, his role in enabling and escalating the discrimination made him legally liable for the airline's violations. The man who had smugly explained why Susan Whitmore deserved special accommodation found himself explaining to unemployment counselors why he had been fired for cause. Sarah Thompson's suspension without pay gave her time to reflect on how quickly her customer service smile had faded when faced with a black passenger asserting his rights. Her career trajectory, once pointed toward promotion to senior crew positions, now led to sensitivity training and probationary employment status. But the most satisfying collapse belonged to Susan Whitmore herself. The investigation revealed a pattern of entitled behavior that went far beyond stolen airplane seats. She had repeatedly bullied flight crews into unauthorized upgrades, fabricated elite status claims, and used accusations of harassment to intimidate airline employees who questioned her demands. Her law firm, Whitmore and Associates, faced immediate social media backlash as Marcus's video went viral, accompanied by the hashtag #EconomyClassLies. The professional consequences for Susan were swift and merciless. Her legal practice specialized in corporate compliance, a field where credibility and trustworthiness were paramount. Clients began questioning how they could trust an attorney who had been caught in such a public and calculated deception. Within a week, she was placed on administrative leave as her firm conducted its own investigation into conduct unbecoming a member of the bar. The passenger who had dismissed Marcus's concerns with "just take the upgrade" found his own social media presence scrutinized as the video spread. His company, already under pressure to improve diversity and inclusion metrics, quietly transferred him to a less visible position after receiving multiple complaints about his employees' public display of racial insensitivity. Airport security officers Johnson and Martinez faced different fates based on their handling of the situation. Johnson received an official reprimand for his immediate assumption of Marcus's guilt and his failure to investigate before threatening arrest. The incident became a case study in his department's bias training programs. Officer Martinez, whose professional skepticism and insistence on proper procedure had helped expose the truth, received a commendation and promotion to senior security supervisor. His questioning of the crew's narrative and demand for documentation had prevented a much larger civil rights violation. Marcus's legal team, led by civil rights attorney James Thompson, filed a comprehensive federal complaint with the Department of Transportation that went far beyond the single incident. Using Marcus's extensive industry connections and resources, they documented a pattern of discriminatory treatment across Delta's operations, interviewing dozens of passengers who had experienced similar bias but lacked the platform or resources to fight back. The DOT investigation that followed was unprecedented in its scope and findings. Delta agreed to a $50 million settlement that included comprehensive bias training for all employees, an independent oversight committee for discrimination complaints, and a victim compensation fund for passengers who had experienced similar treatment. The ripple effects extended throughout the aviation industry. The Federal Aviation Administration issued new guidelines requiring airlines to document and report discrimination incidents. Congressional hearings on systemic bias in air travel brought Marcus before Congress as a key witness, where his testimony helped shape new federal protections for air passengers. Delta's board of directors, under pressure from shareholders and regulators, implemented sweeping policy changes. CEO Thomas Brennan personally apologized to Marcus in a public statement that acknowledged the company's failures and committed to rebuilding trust through action, not just words. But perhaps the most meaningful consequence was the message sent to countless passengers who had experienced similar treatment but lacked the resources to fight back. Marcus established the Air Travel Equality Foundation, using his settlement funds to provide legal support for passengers facing discrimination. The foundation's hotline received hundreds of calls in its first week, revealing the true scope of the problem Marcus had exposed. The young woman who had recorded the incident became a powerful advocate for passenger rights, her video testimony helping to convict other airline employees of discriminatory practices. Her courage in documenting and sharing the truth had amplified Marcus's platform and ensured the story reached beyond corporate boardrooms to living rooms across America. Susan Whitmore's economic boarding pass, the piece of paper that had ultimately exposed the entire conspiracy, was displayed in the Air Travel Equality Foundation's office as a reminder that truth always surfaces when someone has the courage and resources to demand it. The transformation was complete. A system that had casually dehumanized Marcus Reed had been forced to confront its own contradictions and reform itself in response. The message was clear: discrimination would no longer be tolerated as the cost of doing business. 3 months after the incident, Marcus Reed sat in his Los Angeles office as the late afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of gold and amber. The view of LAX had become more than scenic. It was a daily reminder of how one moment of moral courage had reshaped an entire industry. His assistant had cleared his calendar for a video interview with 60 Minutes, where he would reflect on the incident that had transformed him from a successful businessman into an unexpected civil rights icon. "People ask me why I didn't just take the business class seat and avoid the confrontation," Marcus began, his voice carrying the same measured authority that had commanded respect in boardrooms for decades. But that question misses the fundamental point. Every time we accept discrimination for the sake of convenience, every time we tell ourselves it's not worth the fight, we enable a system that relies on our silence to survive. He leaned back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. The interview would reach millions of viewers, many of whom had never experienced the particular humiliation of being presumed guilty simply because of their race. But he also knew many others would recognize themselves in his story. The countless moments when they had been asked to accommodate other people's prejudices for the sake of keeping the peace. "This wasn't about my ego or an airplane seat," Marcus continued. "This was about challenging the unconscious bias that affects millions of travelers every day. When authority figures immediately assume guilt based on appearance, when reasonable solutions always require the victim to compromise their rights, when crowd pressure enforces an unjust status quo, that's systemic discrimination operating exactly as it was designed to." Marcus gestured toward the wall where dozens of thank you letters were displayed, messages from passengers who had experienced similar treatment, but never had the platform or resources to fight back. Their stories had poured in after his video went viral, revealing a pattern of discrimination that went far deeper than anyone had imagined. The real heroes of that day weren't the executives who apologized after getting caught, he emphasized. They were the passengers who spoke up when they saw injustice. Officer Martinez, who insisted on proper procedure despite pressure to take shortcuts. My team, who activated our crisis response protocols. Change happens when ordinary people choose courage over comfort. The Air Travel Equality Foundation had become Marcus's most meaningful legacy, transforming his settlement money into a powerful force for systemic change. The Foundation's legal team had successfully prosecuted dozens of discrimination cases, while their training programs had educated thousands of airline employees about implicit bias and passenger rights. We didn't just win one dispute over a seat assignment, Marcus reflected. We transformed a negative experience into positive change for an entire industry. That's what justice looks like. Not just punishment for wrongdoers, but systemic improvement that prevents future victims from facing the same treatment. He pulled out his phone and showed the interviewer a recent message from the young woman who had recorded the incident. She was now in law school, specializing in civil rights law, inspired by witnessing how one person's refusal to accept injustice could create waves of change that touch thousands of lives. "Your dignity isn't negotiable," Marcus said, his voice taking on the tone of a professor delivering a crucial lesson. "Your rights aren't suggestions to be ignored when they become inconvenient for others. When you stand up for yourself, you stand up for everyone who comes after you." That seat on Flight 1847 represented something much bigger than first-class comfort. It represented equal treatment, basic respect, human dignity. The conversation turned to the broader implications of his experience, and Marcus chose his words carefully. The goal wasn't to shame individuals who had made mistakes, but to illuminate systems that made those mistakes predictable and preventable. "We've created mandatory bias training for airline employees, independent oversight for discrimination complaints, and a victim compensation fund for passengers who have experienced similar treatment," he explained. "But the most important change is cultural. We've established that discrimination has consequences, that victims don't have to accept unfair treatment, and that silence in the face of injustice enables the very system we claim to oppose." As the interview concluded, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that evening at JFK. He was still CEO of Reed Aviation Holdings, still made the same business decisions and attended the same board meetings. But he was also something he had never intended to become, a symbol of resistance to casual racism, a reminder that power unused in the face of injustice becomes complicity. The Foundation's work continued daily, processing complaints, training airline staff, and supporting passengers who found themselves in situations similar to his own. Each case reinforced the lesson he had learned in Seat 1A. Systemic change required systematic resistance. Marcus Reed had boarded Flight 1847, simply wanting a few hours of peace after a difficult week. He had ended up grounding an airline, reshaping an industry, and discovering that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to move from where you rightfully belong. As viewers across America prepared to hear his story, Marcus Reed had one final message for anyone who had ever been told to accept less than they deserved, to be reasonable in the face of unreasonable treatment, to accommodate other people's prejudices for the sake of avoiding conflict. "Next time you witness discrimination, you have a choice," Marcus said, his words carrying the weight of hard-won experience. "Will you be the bystander who enables it through silence, or will you be the person who speaks up? Will you accept that's just how things work, or will you demand things must work better? Your voice matters more than you know. Your actions count more than you realize. Your refusal to accept injustice changes the world one interaction at a time." He paused, letting the words settle before delivering his final challenge to anyone listening. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Support victims when you see them standing up for their rights. Hold institutions accountable when they fail to live up to their promises. Remember that the most powerful seat isn't in first class. It's the moral high ground where you refuse to compromise your principles for someone else's comfort. Stand up. Speak out. Change the system. Justice doesn't happen accidentally. It happens when good people refuse to stay quiet in the face of wrong. The next time someone tries to make you move from where you rightfully belong, remember that you have the power to ground their entire operation by simply refusing to accept what you know is wrong. Marcus Reed had learned that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply taking your seat and refusing to give it up.